we have to talk about a very widespread mistake that many candidates do while preparing for either a phone or an on-site interview. It's that moment, when you find out that you're going to be screened with questions starting with "tell me about the time when." And the common approach is that you start looking for examples for such questions. And not only you're looking for examples, but you're looking for examples tailored to your specific role. And maybe you look in the job description and try to find out even more clues, and you basically end up with a list of 50 to 100 such behavioral questions. And then you start answering them to the best of your knowledge one by one, and when you're done, hey, voila, I'm now an expert in behavioral interviewing. Well, not an expert, but now you're good enough for an interview, when in fact this couldn't be further from the truth, and this approach is very wrong. Why it's wrong? Well, it's the classic quantity versus quality approach. In other words, your approach is to answer as many questions as possible when compared to answering them as good as possible, right? So there are a couple of exceptions here, like when would you use such lists? For example, if you're working in HR in a senior role, you're already good at behavioral interviewing, you know what this all means, so you're probably going to be looking for some lists to test your knowledge. Yes, that's a scenario where it makes sense. But let's go back to what is the best possible employment of your time while preparing these behavioral interviews, especially if you don't know much about them, like it's the case with most candidates. The approach that I would strongly recommend is to pick your fights carefully. Pick just a handful of such questions and try to answer them well, very well. For example, if we take a not so simple behavioral interviewing question, tell me about the time when you failed. Can you think of a proper answer for this question? If not, take your time, think about the proper answer, and come back to this video to pass that answer through the following list of filters. Does this failure story have anything to do with the job that you're applying for? For example, if you're a software architect, your failure should not be talking about how you failed a previous job interview or how you were impolite to a coworker. Did your failure story get you fired from your last job, or was it a similar type of mistake? Well, then you may want to use another one unless you're really confident it won't disqualify you. Is your failure recent enough to be relevant? Like, for example, if you have 20 years in the workplace and you're talking about how you screwed up your first task on a new role that you started 15 years ago, that is a bit light for a failure. Can you quantify your failure? Doesn't have to be money or time, but is this easy to understand? Like, for example, when you failed a startup, it's quite straightforward. Do you have great learnings from your story? At least 3 of them? Could you talk about your failure in an understandable way in 2 minutes or less? When talking about your failure, did you spend half of the time for the situation, task, and action, and the other half for the learnings? Did you ensure that you're talking about one single failure, not an enumeration of failures? Are you being negative when talking about your learnings? Is this language your normal language, or is it scripted as if you're making a speech in front of 1,000 people? Are you sure this is the best failure that you want to use? It's often that I hear people change their minds after receiving some feedback. So these will be some of the more interesting filters that you would want to apply for this type of question. This is an example of a failure story. So I'm sure you found at least a couple of them that gave you some pointers as when it comes to how to improve your answer there. Now you should do exactly the same approach for at least a couple of others such questions, including the generic ones with "tell me about yourself," which is not necessarily a behavioral question. And believe me when I tell you that time will start flying quite quickly this way. So you will quickly realize that it's not feasible to have an answer to any behavioral question, but your approach will significantly improve the quality of your answers. And the idea is that you become good enough at behavioral interviewing so that you'll be able to successfully improvise something during that phone interview, because after all, you do have experiences that you want to talk about. So how you talk about them is key here, and hopefully deliver a great answer during your either your phone screen or your on-site interview.